a day did you actually fly, and how much petrol did that take?
We would always get ready to fly about with enough petrol to fly about 2 or 3 hours longer than what our planned trip. But the average flight would be about 6.5 hours a day. Very rarely was it less than that, and sometimes I think the longest day was about 11 hours. And sometimes we'd fly like 8 hours across the ocean, seeing nothing else but blue below us, above us, to the sides. And getting petrol was a huge challenge. We used normal motorcar petrol, so it wasn't too bad. But you'd arrive in a country and they tell you can't have petrol, and you wouldn't know why. And it's basically because you had to have a permit for a motor car, and you could only put petrol in that motor car, so we couldn't buy petrol. And that was very challenging. And we would go with our 25-litre containers off to some petrol station, try and buy some, and then you come back to the airport with your two 25-litre containers of petrol, try and get through security to get to the microlights to load up, and try and explain that to a bureaucrat, a security guy, that the petrol you've got is not a petrol bomb, and he doesn't speak your language, and he doesn't even have a clue of what your aeroplane looks like. Those were frustrations, but we made ways around it. The biggest trick we used to do was to get into the newspaper. Wherever we went to, we got hold of the newspapers so that our faces would be in the newspaper the next morning explaining what we were doing. So when we arrived at the security guy with our petrol containers, he would look at us and treat us like celebrities and usher us through. So that made our lives a lot easier getting into the newspaper.
So, Dad, what were the most amazing points of your trip?
Well, Tash, there were quite a few, but I think the thing that came across was that the perceptions we had to the reality of what we actually saw. You know, we were reading in the newspapers about war-torn places and don't go there, it's all scary, and places where people are starving. And I recall the one of Ethiopia, where we were flying into Ethiopia thinking that it's all barren and people are starving, etc. And we flew over the most beautiful landscape, terraced mountains, and over farmlands that looked like patchwork down there. It was beautiful to see. So it was quite a shock to us, the things we got in the media compared to reality, and that was everywhere. The other thing that stood out in a big way is how incredible everybody in the world is. I mean, we would turn to them, ask them for help. They couldn't even understand our language, understand what we were doing, and they would go completely out of their way, even move their families out of their house into neighbors' houses just to let us stay there for the evening. It was a brilliant experience from how amazingly good people are throughout the world.
Dad, I know it wasn't all good, so would you be able to tell us about the story of Karachi?
Yes, I think the part that wasn't that great was how we saw how immensely populated the world was. And I remember the first experience of seeing that was when we arrived flying over Karachi, to look down and to see the enormous amount of people just packed into that tight space. It was frightening, and to see them all moving and the energy down there, it was actually very scary. It even took my breath away, thinking, wow, if you landed up down there, I mean, how do you survive? How will you even come? You get lost forever. And that sort of theme continued as we moved across Asia, how densely populated the world is. And to look down on that is a frightening picture. And you know, we hear so much about global warming and all the rest, and I think that is just such a tiny symptom compared to what the real problems are of so many people. Deforestation, to fly across the Burmese jungle and just watch them cutting it and burning it all down, and logs coming down the rivers in big rafts of tree trunks that have been tied together and going off to the port. To seeing that state, and the quarrying and the amount of development and everything, that was a picture of the world that was quite a sad one to see as to where we are positioned. I remember when we flew over Bangladesh, there's this delta of these rivers coming into the sea as we crossed from India to Bangladesh, and looking down, and we saw these huge long trails in the river going up the river. And when we flew over it closer, we had a look, and it was actually tree trunks tied together side by side, creating these huge barges of kilometers long. And these were trees that were cut down from the Burmese jungle and being sent down the rivers to the port in Bangladesh. And to look at that deforestation, and to look at how it was really, really sad to see that.
So Dad, what were any other impressions you got from the trip? Like, what was it like having a bird's eye view of the whole world?
At times it was absolutely beautiful and awesome. I mean, things we saw, like we would wake up very early. We always took off just before sunrise. And for example, flying across the deserts, to look down and see those caravans of camels and people moving across the desert. And the interesting things, how they dug in dry riverbeds and made holes to look for water. And you carried on flying through the desert, and you'd see areas that had these ruins of these what obviously were round houses in the past, but there are like thousands of it. So the area must have been well populated and green, but there it was absolute desert. And areas along the coast, you'd suddenly come across a ship graveyard with all these ships run on the beach and people cutting it up. There's some fascinating scenery like that. The one part that also struck us was the pollution in Asia. It was scary to see that. At times we couldn't even see half a kilometer in front of us, and even looking downwards from 4,000 or 5,000 feet, you couldn't see the ground. There's just absolute haze, and this would go on. We never saw the blue. When we were on the ground, we sometimes would never see the blue sky, and wondered if some of those children even knew the sky was blue. And some of the stunning scenery, like along the Thailand-Malaysia area, looking down on those beautiful islands which had the most amazing holiday resorts on it. And the December of 2004 tsunami came along and absolutely obliterated all of that. So whether it'll ever be the same, I don't know. But it was beautiful flying through those areas, looking at that scenery. There's also something special about flying over vast expanses of nothingness. Like, we'd sit up in the air for 6-7 hours flying across the desert, and the horizon stayed flat, the sky was blue, below was just the sand, and it stayed like that for hours. And crossing the oceans, man, that took some guts. Heading out knowing you're going to take 8-10 hours of sitting across the ocean. If the weather turned bad, you were going to be in the water. If it was good, you're going to make it. It was just like a bit of a roulette, but it was something scary, but inside of you, you just felt so alive. It was like this, every second was a special moment just to be there.
Dad, do you remember during this trip when you arrived in Australia at around March 2004, and we had a surprise for you at the airport? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was quite a sneaky one of you. As I was getting closer to Adelaide, we were trying to get there by my birthday on the 17th of March, and you seemed to be excited and encouraging me to be there by my birthday. But there was something in the back of your, I don't know, voice or something that I picked up you were up to something sneaky. You know, like only a dad can know about his daughter. What she's up to. And yeah, we traveled. We didn't make it there by the birthday, and when we did eventually arrive and you were at the airport, you came rushing up to us, gave me a kiss and everything. It was just awesome to see you. And a few minutes later, you just kind of said something, did something, and out from behind a bush there popped up my mom, your gran. And it was just awesome to see her on the other side of the world in Australia. I didn't suspect anything, and you had a huge beaming smile on your face. You'd obviously planned it.